End of Days by Zex. Hey Zex, check out this video! Andrew called from inside his room, assumed to be at his laptop watching videos on YouTube. Zex entered the room, an open can of orange cream soda in hand, curious expression on his face. Yeah, Andrew? Is this another one of those self-proclaimed scary stories that pop up on the internet? Like the ones you showed me last week about Squidward killing himself? Zex had a rather disbelieving countenance, looking over his friend's shoulder. The younger of the two, Andrew, was more open-minded than Zex, and could see the creativity in these things, much more than the other would. The screen was dark for a moment, but as soon as Andrew hit the left mouse button, the screen played the official hype trailer for Dead Space. Zex took a fancy to this sort of thing. The blood and gore made his inner psychopath in him drool a waterfall. By no means, though, was he insane or homicidal, but there was that definite allure to that sort of gaming for him. You do know when it launches, right? The younger of the two looks up at the older, grinning from ear to ear. Not only does it launch tomorrow, but I have the money to go and get us a copy. Wait, if it launches tomorrow, don't you have a trip planned to go see your rents for a week scheduled in a couple of days? The two lived alone in a small studio apartment, a phrase most would consider redundant, but nevertheless, it was the life of two men who did not get paid enough to make it on their own. Yeah, I guess there's that. That only means you can get a head start on the game then. He was cheerful, as always. Guess so. Zex didn't like this sort of thing. Playing games that someone else bought, knowing that they wouldn't be able to play it as well for a while, it just didn't sit well with him. I'll try not to have too much fun, I suppose. The night of the launch was like many other game launches, staying up until midnight, standing in line for hours, etc. How that night ended up, though, was GameStop ran out of copies, and they were faced with the only option of going back home. We can always look for other games we can get, you know. Zex offered to the discouraged Andrew, both cold and tired from the long night of waiting outside, for something it seemed they couldn't get. They might have something we would like just as much. The voice of reason as always. He tried to smile, but what came out was a pitiful attempt. The two had been looking forward to this game for months, ever since the trailer announcing its release. What could we get, though? Mass Effect, Pokemon, the new Final Fantasy game? No, Zex replied quickly, sounding irritated. I can't stand Final Fantasy after their 7th installment. I'm never buying another one of Square's games. Ever again. Harsh, he replied, browsing the shelves. Oh, there is a copy of Dead Space left. What's up with the case? Unlike most Xbox 360 cases, this one was grey, but it wasn't too much of a problem to be concerned over, however. The problem was the severed arm on the cover seemed to be accompanied by bloodstains on the actual cover. Don't worry, man. It's gotta be some kind of special edition. The younger of the two decided that he wanted to get to the copy before anyone else got their greasy paws on it and headed over to the register for checkout. Zex stayed back for a bit, looking over the Pokemon games their local GameStop had in stock, but looked over to check up on his friend when there was a commotion at the register. I'm sorry, sir. Unless I'm mistaken, there's no other copy of this game. I'll check in the back, but don't be disappointed if I come up short. The cashier seemed a little disappointed himself, but went to go check up on the availability of the much-desired Dead Space game. After a few minutes of waiting, the employee returned with a single disc in hand. My manager showed me the last copy we had. I'm sorry for misleading you, sir. With no questions as to why only one disc was left, or why they were withholding the copy from the two, the friend decided to count their blessings and head back home. Andrew had packing to do, and Zex had to get some shut-eye, because he planned to gear up for an all-nighter with Dead Space the next day after work. The next day seemed to drag along at work, and Zex was in no mood to handle his manager's bullshit. He had gone in at 1:52 p.m. and had work scheduled until 8 p.m., and 8 could not have come fast enough. When he got home, he decided to skip his shower. Who would be there to smell the day's worth of light sweat anyways? For all intents and purposes, while Andrew was out of town, Zex had the apartment all to his own. He immediately powered up the 360 and stuck in the disc, ready to play a game that promised blood and gore everywhere. Well, he wasn't disappointed, but what he got was something much more than what he had bargained for. A few days went by and Andrew returned to the apartment he and Zex shared. The place was a wreck. What looked to be red paint splattered all over the walls in an odd language he didn't recognize. The couch torn to shreds, and the television looking as if it had been savagely attacked with a brick. The lights had burnt out, and a black burn mark remained on the ceiling where it had finally burst. The carpet was stained red, as if someone spilt wine all over it. He didn't want to look around the place anymore. He just wanted to know where Zex was. Zex? The door to his room was closed, but there was a hole broken into it. The rest of the door cracked in the wake of whatever created the hole. He pushed open the door, leading into a pitch-black room lit only by an iPhone, signaling with its dim, dying light that it was almost out of power and needed to be plugged in. He reached over for the light switch, but nothing. The light was burnt out as well, it seemed. A rather damp, sour, ugly scent came to his nose, the smell close to that of something left out to rot, being decomposed. Figuring that he needed to find out where Zex was, and his room was the only place to look in for clues, he went to his own room to grab his flashlight. When he returned, the light only gave him a flash what was in the room before it went out. He had to resort to turning on the television, which was the only thing that worked fine. Within moments, he found himself living in a nightmare when he saw what would haunt him for the rest of his life. All along the walls was the writing, "It's time. They're watching. The game is the enemy," and a small note pinned to the wall, stained in the same red liquid. When he got closer, the smell confirmed it. The liquid was nothing else but blood, and his subconscious jumped to the conclusion of it being Zek's blood. He pulled the letter from the wall and shone the flashlight on it, reading it aloud. "Andrew, the game is not what we thought it was, and by now, you've seen what it's made me do. These symbols are burned into the back of my eyes, their screams are torturing me, begging for me to join them. They need our bodies, Andrew. They need our bodies. It doesn't matter when you join them, it's already too late. If you get out now, you don't even have to turn on the TV. Maybe you can escape. This will all end. Nobody else will have to die. Just don't turn it on, and they won't have any power over you." Andrew stopped there and dropped the letter. Oh shit. The television's light flickers as if it is a strobe, and a growl comes from behind him, seeming to rise up from the ground. As Andrew turned, he saw the mutated form he knew as Zex, with long, bone-like blades extending from his palms, arms raised over his head, elbows bending the wrong way. His stomach was split open vertically, small arms extending from somewhere along the sides of his exposed intestines and stomach. His pants were tattered and torn, and the look in his eyes gave Andrew a violent shiver down his spine. Before he could do anything, Zex stepped forwards and swung his blade-adorned hands down to the other, but Andrew stopped them by the wrists as the two looked at each other in the eyes. "They needed me to provide bodies for them. It's too late for me. It's too late for you." His macabre head shifted, being drawn back by his neck, and slammed down between Andrew's shoulder and neck, teeth digging deep inside. If that wasn't enough, Zex began tossing his head from side to side, causing large gaping and bloody gashes. The wounds splattered blood all over the walls and all over both of them. Andrew lost his grip on Zach's wrists, making the other able to move them, and so he did. He removed his jaws from his prey and instead plunged the blades on his palms into each side of Andrew, approximately in the area of he had bitten. This caused the prey to yelp and scream in pain, feeling the small hands coming from Zek's stomach claw at his waist and find purchase, eventually able to cut open the other's stomach. For some odd reason, Zex let him go, perhaps preparing to finish him off. Andrew dropped to the ground, clutching his stomach, watching everything it contained spill out. This was way too much for him, and his last moments were spent watching the television screen, which stopped acting like a strobe, and flickering to the idle cutscene, the twisted version of the song "Twinkle Twinkle Little Star" filling the air. Everything started to fade, and the last thing he saw was a bladed hand swinging down, intent on splitting him in half from the top of his head down. But before impact, though, everything blacked out. Morning. It was the day he and Zex were going to go get their copy of Dead Space from GameStop, and Andrew felt as though he had gone through one big mindfuck. As it turned out, they still went to the GameStop that night for the release of the game, and still sat in line until just after midnight. They, as before, were told there were no longer any copies available, and, as before, they decided to stay for a while longer. "We can always look for other games we can get, you know," Zex offered, as the two stood in the middle of the packed store. "They might have something we would like just as much." "The voice of reason as always," he whispered, trying to smile, but he still could only produce a pitiful attempt at a grin. After all, the two had been looking forward to this game for months, ever since the trailer announcing its release. What could we get, though? Mass Effect? Pokemon? The new Final Fantasy game? "No," Zex replied quickly, sounding irritated at the mention of the series. "I can't stand Final Fantasy after the 7th installment. I'm never buying another one of Square games ever again." "Harsh," he replied, browsing the shelves. As he had before all of this happened, he found the odd Dead Space case, but decided to overlook it. "They don't have anything interesting. We should go home." After a moment, Zex nodded. "Yeah, we can find the game again when the next shipment come in." "Maybe in the car in a bit, Andrew. I'll be paying for a copy to be held aside while they get more, alright?" "Alright," he echoed, smiling to himself. All of what he had experienced seemed to be fading away bit by bit as he exited the store and waited by the car. However, as Zex came out, Andrew noticed one thing off. He had a copy of Dead Space in his hand, and it was too late to do anything about it this time. That was End of Days. Final thoughts? I got extremely annoyed while reading this story. By far the most annoyed I've ever gotten while reading a creepypasta for this show. The first problem I ran across in this story is that there were a lot of unnecessary bits of social commentary thrown in, like not liking Final Fantasy games past the 7th game and almost immediately saying that he didn't like the story Squidward's suicide. I can understand why Zex, the author, not the character, would want to add more character to the characters by giving them opinions like this, but seeing as it's always Zex doing this, and the author named the character after himself, it seems like it's just a self-insert character that constantly announces the author's opinions on completely unrelated things. Knowing these things do not add anything to the story as a whole is extremely distracting. The second problem is that this is not a video game creepypasta. This story has nothing to do with Dead Space that couldn't be completely replaced with a find and replace function. You could have replaced the Dead Space disc with inserting a new movie into a DVD player and make Zex turn into any kind of mutilated monster that wasn't the exact same as one in Dead Space, and the story would be the exact same. If you can replace all of the words in a story relating to a game without replacing anything in between, and the story still makes sense, the story isn't rooted in the game nearly deep enough. This is just a self-insert horror story. The third major problem would be that the story doesn't even try creepy. It's just blood, gore, and action scenes. I've gone over this before in my afterthoughts. Gore isn't creepy. Being creeped out is 100% different, completely different emotion than being grossed out. People only seem to relate the two because often shit horror films will try to gross people out rather than actually scaring them or creeping them out. The fourth and final major problem, it's pretty cliché. Person finds scary game, person gets possessed in some way by scary game, writing in blood all over, possessed person trying to warn people off. It doesn't work. This story has been written 1,000 times, just usually with a slightly different premise each time. This is the fourth fan-made story in a row that didn't get nearly enough peer editing and feedback, and it greatly disappoints me. We used to have all kinds of great in-depth reviews and feedback on stories made on the forum, but it looks like not as many people want to anymore. If anyone at home would like to help peer edit stories, by all means go to the Creepypasta section of the forum. It's in the description below. That's it for this week's Creepypasta. Tune in again next week when we tackle yet another story made and sent in by the fans with Evie's Stone of the Burned Tower. If you want to write your own story, help peer edit a story, or even just read the stories early, check out the description where you'll find a link to the Creepypasta section of my forum. You'll also find a link to the playlist of every Creepypasta reading I've done. Remember that if you want your story to be read on the show, you must stay active on your post on the forum as well as read the forum rules. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, sweet dreams.